Shadows of the Future by Storm Queen 873. Chapter 6. Master Jin! Qui-Gon turned away from the serving table at the sound of his name, slightly surprised by the greeting. He hadn't expected to find anyone in the galley so early. He smiled when he found Padme standing before him, dressed in her yellow, fluttering handmaiden gown. She returned his smile, her head dipping in a polite bow, and she moved to stand beside him.
"Good morning, young handmaiden," he greeted as she took a plate from the top of the pile at the end of the table and began to spoon herself some of the pale orange protein dish. Qui-Gon assumed that it had been engineered to imitate Naboo scrambled eggs, which were perishable and hard to come by. "Good morning," she responded, and he passed her the spatula for the Corellian tubers, which had been sliced into thin strips formed into patties and then fried. Corellian tubers, unlike Naboo eggs, were ridiculously easy to procure and kept for years. "I trust you and your Padawan slept well?" "We did, thank you,"
he said, selecting several pieces of a thinly sliced and fried meat that he couldn't identify and adding them to his plate.
"And yourself? How was the Queen faring?"
Padme shot him an oblique look. "The Queen is anxious for our arrival, but preparations for her upcoming address of the Senate have kept her occupied," the girl said. "She wanted me to ask if you wouldn't mind meeting with her later today to discuss what she might say."
"I'm not a politician," Qui-Gon replied. "I'm afraid I might not be much help."
"Any help is better than none," she returned before blinking at something off to Qui-Gon's right. "2 plates, Padawan Kenobi?" she asked, and Qui-Gon turned his head slightly to find that Obi-Wan was indeed attempting to balance 2 plates full of food in one arm. Cutlery had been poised along the edges precariously, and after pausing for a moment, he moved to collect 2 glasses of synthetic muja juice with his free hand.
"Oh, only one for me," he said, glancing up briefly to throw them both a small grin. "The other is for Anakin, who got the easy job of picking out a table." "Go," Qui-Gon told him, sending his disbelief along the bond. "I'll join you shortly. If you manage to make it there with the plates in one piece," he added, smiling a little as Obi-Wan said with a sour expression. "Ha ha, Master, very funny," he said and turned to go. "But we'll certainly see who has the true last laugh, won't we?" How Obi-Wan managed the small bow he gave Padme without dropping or spilling anything left Qui-Gon puzzling for a moment, especially since the Obi-Wan he remembered couldn't have managed that recklessly graceful movement. But he finally sighed and shook his head. His apprentice had a lot to answer for, and now was not the time to start in on questioning.
"I'm glad I ran into you, Master Jin," Padme said, bringing him from his thoughts, and he poured 2 glasses of the muja juice for them. "When we stopped briefly last night for the next portion of our jump, we managed to receive the latest news reports, as well as a message from the Jedi Council. I'd planned to stop by your cabin after breakfast to bring you a copy, but since you're here, I could just give it to you now."
"Thank you, handmaiden Naberi,"
he said as he handed her the second glass, and she nodded her head in thanks.
"Would you care to join us? I'm sure there'll be room."
She smiled. "I would be delighted to." The 2 moved from the kitchen section of the galley to the dining area, which was full of long rectangular tables and padded benches. There were a few smaller circular tables in the back, and it seemed Anakin had chosen one of those. Obi-Wan stood before the boy, holding out the 2 plates, and had raised his eyebrows in a silent question.
"Pick one, Annie,"
Qui-Gon heard him say, and the boy began to scrutinize both of the plates, tapping a finger against his chin.
"And do hurry. I'd like to eat before my food grows cold."
"That one!" Anakin said at last, accepting the plate from Obi-Wan, who pulled out a chair and sat down. "What is all this stuff, anyway?"
"It's better not to ask that," Obi-Wan said, his gaze flicking to Qui-Gon's, who had to suppress a smile at the familiar mischievous glint in his apprentice's blue-green eyes. "A lot of cultures eat some of the strangest foods, and when you know the seemingly delicious platter before you is actually ground-up insect guts..." Anakin's face crumpled in utter horror.
"People actually eat that kind of stuff?"
"Look at the Hutts," Obi-Wan replied, reaching for some seasoning and liberally sprinkling it over the protein substitute. "They eat insects, don't they?"
"Well, yeah, but they're not normal,"
Anakin said, poking his food dubiously.
"They're not a good example."
"Don't listen to Obi-Wan, Annie," Qui-Gon said as he moved to sit across from his Padawan. "He just wants you to give up on your food so he doesn't have to go back for seconds." Obi-Wan rolled his eyes good-naturedly, and his amusement easily reached Qui-Gon over the bond. "Besides," Qui-Gon added, "you're right about the Hutts. There are many other species, more humanoid ones, whose dishes are digestible by humans and yet are completely unpalatable. You're referring to the aboriginal people of the Ursak V? Obi-Wan asked, the glint fading from his eyes. It was replaced with one that was distinctly more weary. The very same, Qui-Gon responded, letting his gaze meet Obi-Wan's. I seem to recall a Padawan who nearly got us thrown off the planet simply because he didn't care for the cuisine. Did you really? Anakin asked breathlessly, his eyes wide as he stared up at Obi-Wan, who huffed a little. Master, that cuisine, as you so aptly put it, was crawling off my plate, he said, and Anakin gawked. Of course I was going to have some objections about eating it, especially considering that the creature was roughly the size of my head. Qui-Gon gave a small shrug as he reached for the seasoning and the Corellian catsup. Minor details, Padawan. You still managed to throw up all over the Tirsan ambassador, ruining his best set of robes. How I salvaged that situation is a mystery none will solve. I softened to giggle through their attention to the fourth member of their party, whom Qui-Gon had completely forgotten about. If Jedi can banter back and forth over their morning meal, then I'm sure the Queen has nothing to worry about, Padme said as she took a seat beside him, setting her plate across from Anakin's before handing Qui-Gon a datapad, and he smiled in thanks. Padme! Anakin exclaimed happily as she sat. You're up awfully early. I have to be, as many of the Queen's appointments are normally a few hours after sunrise. I've gotten used to the schedule, she responded, picking up a fork and taking a bite of her breakfast. And as for food, Annie, I assure you that none of this has insects in it. The people of Naboo don't eat them. Thanks, the boy said, smiling gratefully, and he moved to copy the handwritten. They ate in relative silence for a while, with Qui-Gon scanning the messages from the council and determining to send one of his own during the next brief lull between jumps. He then moved on to the news reports, searching for any further information about the situation with Naboo, and was surprised when he came across so little. Shocking, isn't it? He glanced up at Padme. Pardon? She jerked her chin at the datapad in his grasp. I mean, it's shocking to find next to nothing about my planet's situation. You'd think that news of a blockade on a peaceful planet would command headlines across all news stations, yet there's barely an article or two, she said, and Qui-Gon sensed her outrage spike. My people are dying because of the Trade Federation blockade, and not one of those mere paragraphs has gotten the facts straight. That, unfortunately, is the nature of reporting, Qui-Gon said soberly, while catching snatches of the conversation Obi-Wan had engaged Anakin in. The boy was complaining about the complete lack of flavor in the protein dish. In this day and age, there is little desire for truth. And more desire for higher circulation, Padme finished, sighing faintly as she started in on her tubers. Her gaze meandered to the opposite side of the table, and when a small smile played across her lips, Qui-Gon glanced up to find Obi-Wan seasoning a small portion of Anakin's food. Try that, his apprentice said, the two completely oblivious to their audience. Anakin complied, his frown instantly brightening. See? Not so bad now, Yeah, you were right, the boy responded, reaching for the seasoning. It gave it the kick that it needed. Your apprentice seems different, Padme said quietly as she watched the two, and Qui-Gon glanced at her before returning his gaze to the datapad. He seems warmer, more confident. How do you mean? He asked, his tone utterly indifferent, though inside he was frowning. It seemed he wasn't the only one to notice. You'll forgive me for going on first impressions, she said around bites of her food. But when I met your Padawan, he seemed very cold, very calm. I never would have guessed he had a softer side. We all have different sides, different faces that we choose not to reveal until we are certain of those around us. Qui-Gon responded, not looking up, and he sensed the flash of guilt that rushed through the girl. Even though we are Jedi, we are still human, and certain habits will remain ingrained in us. She dropped the subject in favor of one of the articles Qui-Gon was reading. I see you've come across the Trade Federation's explanation for the event, she asked, and he nodded absently, absorbed in his reading. It's the most disgusting little bit of falsehood I've ever read, she added, attacking her meat in a particularly vicious manner, and apparently it was enough to pique Obi-Wan's attention as a soft query rolled through the bond. What do you say to make her so upset, Master? Qui-Gon started a little at the thought, his gaze flicking up to Obi-Wan, who was watching them from the corner of his eye. Nothing in particular. She's just anxious about the Senate. She fears that we're wasting precious time in attempting to plead her people's case. Obi-Wan chewed his food slowly, and Qui-Gon could sense a mood of deep contemplation settling on the Padawan. Is there anything of interest in the news report? Anything that might give her that particular impression? It must be the lack of substantial articles, Qui-Gon responded, taking a bite of his food as he continued reading. She feels that since no one is bothering to report it properly, no one in the Senate will listen. And Qui-Gon could sense a mood of deep contemplation settling on the Padawan. Is there anything of interest in the news report? Anything that might give her that particular impression? It must be the lack of substantial articles, Qui-Gon responded, taking a bite of his food as he continued reading. She feels that since no one is bothering to report it properly, no one in the Senate will listen. She feels that since no one is bothering to report it properly, no one in the Senate will listen. A faint grimace tugged on Obi-Wan's lips, and Qui-Gon sensed a thread of frustration curling through the bond. She might be right, you know. Obi-Wan met his gaze fully at that thought, and Qui-Gon felt his lips tighten before he went back to reading. It is possible, he consented. I do find the lack of news disturbing, but what other options do we have, Padawan? We have no army to oust the invaders. Two Jedi can do little against the forces we saw massing on Naboo. We might not have an army. Your sense of perception is growing stronger, Padawan, Qui-Gon said, sensing Obi-Wan's mental grin. It's kind of funny, actually, the young man responded. She thinks she has us completely fooled. Let it stay that way, Qui-Gon said. We cannot afford to destroy her cover. It is useful, especially for hiding from the enemies who will undoubtedly seek to counter us on Coruscant. Obi-Wan sent his agreement, but their mental conversation was broken by a giggle from Padme and an exasperated cry from Anakin. Obi-Wan, stop it! The boy exclaimed, and Padme let out yet another giggle, but this time she tried to smother it. I just want some of that sauce, so quit making it avoid me! What makes you think I'm doing anything, Annie? Obi-Wan asked, his tone perfectly confused, but Qui-Gon heard the mental snicker. He glanced up from his datapad just in time to see Anakin make a mad grab for the catsup bottle, which quickly twisted out of his path. Obi-Wan! Annie, how could I be moving that bottle? Qui-Gon heard his Padawan ask. Do you see me touching it at all? Well, no. The bottle made another miraculous escape, and Qui-Gon set down his datapad in shock, gaping at the sight. But I know you're doing it. You're a Jedi. You could be moving it with your mind, the boy said, frowning in concentration as he focused on the bottle, which happened to be doing a jaunty little jig as it sat just out of reach. Padme erupted into a fit of giggles at the sight, and Qui-Gon looked up at his apprentice, his gaze incredulous. Maybe. The mysterious note to his voice maddening, and Qui-Gon could sense exasperation rolling off Anakin. But you got no proof, didn't you? Once or catch that stupid bottle! Anakin made another attempt when the bottle danced teasingly within reach, only to have it zip through his fingers. Ow! This isn't fair! You got Jedi powers! Obi-Wan laughed, the sound echoing in the empty dining area, and Qui-Gon found himself staring. He had never known his apprentice to be so playful with anyone outside of his innermost circle of friends. He and Qui-Gon would tease back and forth incessantly. The moving battle was something Qui-Gon had subjected Obi-Wan to on occasion. But to have this sort of attitude surface around people who were one step above strangers was unheard of. He really bonded with that boy, Qui-Gon thought as he watched Obi-Wan apologetically hand Anakin the wayward bottle, who snatched it up and frowned at the Padawan. Obi-Wan softly asked for forgiveness when he saw the dark expression, and Qui-Gon smiled when Anakin grumbled and grinned. Promise you won't tease like that again? I promise, Obi-Wan said solemnly, and Padme was once again stifling giggles. At least until you are able to fight back properly. Deal? Qui-Gon quirked an eyebrow at that. Know something I don't, Padawan? He said, but Obi-Wan merely brushed the comment aside. Damn! Anakin replied enthusiastically, and Obi-Wan ruffled his blonde hair affectionately.
Qui-Gon blinked when he felt the living force swirl around the two, adding another layer to the bond that had unexpectedly formed, and broadcasting their emotions easily. Obi-Wan's presence seemed to soothe Anakin's in a way, perhaps explaining why the bond had formed in the first place, while Obi-Wan was brimming with happiness. Again, there was the sense of rightness, a warmth that enveloped the two, which made Qui-Gon smile. Qui-Gon knew his apprentice. He knew how compassionate the young man could be when he chose to let it show. Possibly the only thing that Qui-Gon regretted over the past few years was watching Obi-Wan build walls around himself, and every trying mission only making those walls stronger. It was wonderful to see him teasing and laughing, and Qui-Gon had a sneaking suspicion that they had those visions to thank for it, even with all the other alarming changes. Nodding to himself a little, Qui-Gon set aside the datapad, resolving not to look at it for the rest of the meal, and joined in on the lighthearted mood. If one of the cooks happened to glance up, or if another passenger entered and saw two grown Jedi, a handmaiden, and a boy playing tag in the dining area, who cared? Live in the moment, the Jedi said, and Qui-Gon intended to do so for as long as possible.